I don't want to go home tonight. The words floated through the empty parking garage like they didn't belong there. Marcus Hale stopped pushing the floor buffer and looked up slowly. The machine hummed beneath his hands, its low vibration echoing against the concrete walls of the underground level. It was almost midnight, the kind of hour when office towers turned hollow and quiet, when the city above still buzzed but the spaces below felt forgotten. Marcus had learned to appreciate that silence. It meant the work went faster. It meant fewer people staring at the man with the maintenance badge. But tonight the silence had cracked. A few yards away, near one of the gray support columns, a woman leaned against the concrete like gravity had suddenly become heavier than usual. Her heels were in one hand. Her phone hung loosely in the other. Even in the dim fluorescent light, Marcus recognized her immediately. Olivia Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Logistics. His boss. His boss's boss. The kind of boss whose name lived on the glass walls upstairs and in the business magazines stacked in the break room no one ever read. She wasn't supposed to be down here, and she definitely wasn't supposed to be sitting on the cold floor of a parking garage. Marcus turned off the buffer. The sudden quiet made the moment feel sharper. "Ma'am," he said carefully, keeping his voice low so it wouldn't startle her. Olivia blinked up at him like the word had traveled a long distance before reaching her ears. Her eyes were unfocused, but not empty, the way someone's eyes get after a long night pretending to be stronger than they actually feel. "What time is it?" she asked, her voice dry, like she had been speaking all evening and finally ran out of energy. Marcus checked the watch on his wrist. A little after 11:45. She laughed softly, though it didn't sound like humor. It sounded more like disbelief. "Too late for meetings," she murmured. "Too early for regrets." Marcus didn't respond right away. Years of working jobs like this had taught him something simple. People in expensive clothes sometimes needed the same thing as everyone else. Quiet, space, and someone who didn't ask questions too quickly. He set the machine aside and walked a few steps closer, careful not to crowd her. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked. Olivia looked at him like she was trying to remember where she'd seen his face before. Maybe in the hallway. Maybe on an elevator ride she barely noticed. Her gaze drifted past him to the old pickup truck parked nearby, the one with the faded blue paint and the small booster seat visible through the back window. The kind of truck that carried grocery bags, homework folders, and the tired routine of a single parent trying to keep life steady. "You ever wish you could just disappear for a night?" she asked suddenly. Marcus shrugged slightly. "Sometimes," he said. Olivia pushed herself up from the floor, but wobbled almost immediately. Marcus stepped forward instinctively, catching her elbow before she lost balance. He let go the second she steadied herself. No lingering contact, just enough to keep her from falling. The garage lights buzzed above them. Somewhere outside, a car passed on the street, the sound distant and brief. Olivia looked at the rows of empty parking spaces, then back at him. "I shouldn't drive," she admitted quietly. Marcus nodded once. He had already noticed the faint scent of champagne in the air. "Probably not," he said. She glanced at him again, this time more focused. "You're Marcus, right?" He seemed mildly surprised she knew. "Yes, ma'am." Olivia studied him for a moment, then gestured weakly toward the exit ramp. "Would you mind helping me get home?" Marcus looked toward the dark street beyond the garage, then back at the tired woman standing in front of him. After a short pause, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his truck keys. "Sure," he said calmly. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Marcus walked her slowly across the concrete floor toward the old blue pickup truck parked near the corner of the garage. The quiet felt heavier now that the floor buffer had stopped humming. Olivia moved carefully, one hand resting lightly against the side of the truck as if she needed a moment to remember how balance worked. Marcus opened the passenger door without a word. The interior light flicked on, revealing a cab that was clean but clearly lived in. A small booster seat sat in the back. A stack of second-grade spelling worksheets rested on the center console beside a half-empty thermos of black coffee. Olivia paused before climbing in. Her eyes moved across the details with quiet curiosity. "You have a kid," she said softly. Marcus nodded, once while walking around the front of the truck. "Yes, ma'am. My son Ethan, 7 years old." Olivia eased into the seat and leaned her head back against the headrest as Marcus started the engine. The pickup rumbled to life with the familiar sound of an older truck that had earned every mile on its odometer. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Marcus adjusted the heater and guided the truck toward the ramp leading out of the garage. The cold December air outside fogged slightly against the windshield before the defroster cleared it away. The city streets were quieter now, but not empty. Traffic lights blinked yellow at certain intersections, and the glow of late-night diners spilled across sidewalks where a few tired people still moved through the night. Olivia stared out the passenger window as the buildings slid past in soft reflections of neon and streetlight. "You did not ask where I live," she said after a moment. Marcus kept his eyes on the road. "I figured you would tell me when you were ready." She turned her head slightly toward him as if studying that answer. "Most people ask right away," she said. "Most people want to know who they are helping." Marcus shrugged a little. "Sometimes people just need a ride, not an interview." Olivia gave a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. The truck continued through downtown, and then toward the quieter residential streets farther west. After a few minutes Olivia spoke again. "Actually, I would rather not go to the house tonight." Marcus glanced over briefly, but did not question her. "All right," he said simply. She rested her elbow against the door and watched the streetlights pass overhead one by one. "Home does not feel very peaceful tonight," she added quietly. Marcus thought for a moment as the truck rolled through a four-way stop. "My place is about 10 minutes from here," he said. "Nothing fancy, just an apartment above a hardware store. But it is warm." Olivia looked at him again. There was hesitation in her eyes, but not fear. Just the strange uncertainty of accepting kindness from someone who expected nothing in return. "You would let your boss crash on your couch?" she asked. Marcus slowed at another red light and glanced at the empty intersection before answering. "Tonight you do not look like my boss," he said calmly. "You look like someone who had a long day." The light turned green. The truck moved forward again. For the first time since they left the garage, Olivia closed her eyes and allowed herself to rest quietly against the seat while the soft hum of the engine carried them through the sleeping city. The pickup truck slowed as Marcus turned onto a narrower street lined with small brick buildings and quiet storefronts that had closed hours earlier. A faded sign reading Carter Hardware hung above the corner shop, its metal frame creaking slightly in the cold night breeze. Marcus parked beside the building and shut off the engine. For a moment neither of them moved. The sudden silence inside the truck felt softer than the city noise they had just left behind. Olivia opened her eyes slowly, as if she had only meant to rest them for a second. She looked around, trying to orient herself. "This is your place?" she asked quietly. Marcus nodded and reached for the door handle. "Apartment is upstairs," he said. "Nothing special, but it is quiet." Olivia stepped out of the truck carefully, steadying herself against the door. The night air was cooler here than downtown, carrying the faint scent of sawdust drifting up from the hardware store below. Marcus locked the truck and walked toward the narrow stairwell beside the shop. A single porch light flickered above the door, casting a warm circle of light onto the steps. Olivia followed him up the wooden staircase, each step creaking softly under their weight. At the top, Marcus unlocked a simple apartment door and pushed it open. The inside was modest but neat. A small living room held a worn couch, a bookshelf filled with school papers and paperbacks, and a coffee table with a half-built model rocket resting beside a box of crayons. A refrigerator in the small kitchen area was covered in drawings held up by magnets shaped like planets. Olivia paused in the doorway, looking around slowly. There was no sign of luxury anywhere in the room, but the place carried a quiet warmth that expensive houses sometimes missed. Marcus walked to the kitchen counter and filled a glass with water from the sink. "You should drink this," he said, setting the glass gently on the coffee table. Olivia stepped inside and sat down on the couch, wrapping her hands around the glass. The cool water seemed to bring her back to herself a little. She glanced toward the drawings on the refrigerator. One of them showed a stick figure man standing beside a smaller stick figure under a bright yellow sun. "Ethan drew those?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "Most of them," he said. "He likes rockets and dinosaurs. Changes every week." Olivia studied the room quietly for a moment longer. "Where is he tonight?" Marcus walked to the hallway and gently closed a bedroom door that was slightly open. "Staying with my sister across town," he replied softly. "She helps when I have late shifts." Olivia lowered her eyes to the glass in her hands. The apartment felt calm, almost protective, like a place where the outside world could not easily reach. Marcus pulled a folded blanket from a nearby chair and set it on the couch beside her. You can sleep here, he said. Bathroom is down the hall. Towels are in the cabinet. Olivia looked up at him with a small trace of surprise. And you? She asked. Marcus gave a faint shrug and nodded toward the kitchen table. I have slept in worse places, he said simply. Olivia leaned back against the couch, the tension in her shoulders finally loosening as the quiet of the apartment settled around them. Marcus turned off the bright overhead light and left only a small lamp glowing beside the bookshelf. The soft light filled the room with a gentle warmth while the city outside continued its distant midnight rhythm far beyond the apartment walls. The apartment settled into a quiet rhythm as the minutes passed. Outside, a distant car rolled down the street and faded away, leaving only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of a wall clock above the kitchen doorway. Olivia sat on the couch holding the glass of water, her eyes moving slowly across the room, as if she were studying a world completely different from the one she usually lived in. The blanket Marcus had placed beside her rested neatly folded against the cushion. She picked it up and wrapped it around her shoulders. The fabric smelled faintly like laundry soap and cedar from the closet. It was a simple smell, the kind that belonged to ordinary homes. Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his thermos in front of him, pouring a small amount of coffee into the lid. He did not look toward her, not out of distance, but out of respect for the quiet moment she seemed to need. Olivia watched him for a second before speaking. You are not curious, she said softly. Marcus lifted his eyes briefly. About what? Olivia tilted her head slightly. About why your boss is sitting on your couch in the middle of the night after too much champagne and a company party. Marcus took a slow sip of coffee before answering. People have long days, he said calmly. Sometimes the long days just happen to wear expensive shoes. Olivia stared at him for a moment, and then let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like relief. The tension that had followed her all evening seemed to ease just a little more. She leaned her head back against the couch and closed her eyes. The lamp beside the bookshelf cast a soft circle of light across the room, touching the model rocket on the table and the drawings on the refrigerator door. After a few minutes, Olivia spoke again, her voice lower now. Do you ever feel like the louder your life becomes, the harder it is to hear yourself think? Marcus considered the question. Sometimes, he said. That is why I like working nights. Olivia opened one eye and looked toward him. Because it is quiet? Marcus nodded. Because people stop pretending when the building empties out. Olivia smiled faintly at that, but did not respond right away. Instead, she pulled the blanket closer and let the calm of the apartment settle around her. Marcus stood and moved quietly toward the hallway to check the bedroom door again. He made sure it was closed so the hallway light would not reach the living room. When he returned to the kitchen, he dimmed the lamp slightly. Olivia shifted on the couch, curling slightly under the blanket as the warmth and stillness began to pull her toward sleep. Marcus, she murmured after a moment. He paused beside the kitchen counter. Yes, ma'am. She opened her eyes again and looked around the small room filled with drawings and school projects and ordinary life. Your home feels peaceful. Marcus gave a small nod. Ethan likes it that way, he said quietly. Olivia watched him for a second longer before her eyes finally drifted closed again. Within a few minutes, her breathing slowed into the steady rhythm of someone who had finally stopped carrying the weight of the day. Marcus returned to the kitchen table and sat down again, folding his hands around the warm coffee lid. He glanced once toward the couch to make sure she was comfortable, then turned his attention back to the quiet apartment while the long night continued gently outside the windows. Morning arrived slowly through the thin curtains above the apartment window. Pale winter sunlight slipped into the living room and stretched across the wooden floor until it reached the edge of the couch. Olivia stirred beneath the blanket as the quiet light touched her face. For a few seconds, she did not remember where she was. The room around her felt unfamiliar, but strangely calm. No glass walls. No polished marble floors. No assistants knocking on the door with a tablet full of meetings. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic beginning to wake somewhere across the city. She pushed herself up slowly and sat on the couch, the blanket sliding from her shoulders. Her heels were neatly placed beside the coffee table. A folded towel rested nearby with a small note written in careful handwriting. Bathroom down the hall. Coffee in the kitchen. Olivia stared at the note for a moment before standing. Her head still felt slightly heavy, but the water from the night before had done its job. The apartment smelled faintly of fresh coffee and something warm cooking on a stovetop. She followed the scent into the small kitchen area and stopped quietly at the doorway. Marcus stood at the stove flipping pancakes in a cast-iron pan. The morning light from the window fell across the kitchen counter where a small stack of plates waited beside a bottle of maple syrup. Marcus glanced over his shoulder when he sensed her presence. "Morning," he said simply. Olivia blinked, surprised by the ordinary scene unfolding in front of her. "You cook breakfast for every unexpected guest?" she asked. Marcus placed a pancake onto a plate and shrugged slightly. "I cook breakfast every morning," he said. "It is easier when Ethan is here." Olivia stepped closer to the counter, noticing the small calendar pinned beside the refrigerator. Several school events were marked in bright blue ink. A science fair, a spelling test, a drawing of a rocket taped beside the dates. "He really likes rockets," she said quietly. Marcus nodded and poured a cup of coffee before sliding it gently across the counter toward her. "He says they are the only machines that know exactly where they are going," Marcus replied. Olivia wrapped her hands around the warm mug and took a slow sip. The coffee was strong and simple, nothing like the expensive blends usually waiting in her office upstairs. But it felt grounding in a way she could not explain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The morning sun brightened the room a little more, touching the drawings on the refrigerator and the model rocket on the table. Olivia leaned against the counter and looked around again as if memorizing the quiet details of the apartment. "Marcus," she said carefully, "about last night." Marcus shook his head gently before she could finish. "You needed a place to rest," he said. "That is all that happened." Olivia studied his face, noticing the calm certainty in his voice. There was no curiosity, no expectation, just the same quiet steadiness that had followed her from the parking garage to this kitchen. She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped when a phone vibration broke the silence. The sound came from the coffee table in the living room. Olivia walked over and picked up her phone. The screen was filled with notifications. Dozens of missed calls. Messages stacked one after another from numbers she recognized immediately. Assistants, board members, corporate attorneys. Her expression changed slightly as she opened the first message and read the headline attached beneath it. For a long moment she said nothing. Marcus watched quietly from the kitchen doorway while the morning sunlight continued to pour into the apartment. Olivia remained standing beside the coffee table while the phone screen continued lighting up with new notifications every few seconds. The quiet apartment that had felt peaceful only a moment earlier now carried a different weight. Marcus stayed near the kitchen doorway, watching without asking questions. Olivia slowly lowered herself onto the edge of the couch again, her eyes scanning the messages one by one. Headlines from business blogs appeared across the screen, followed by a series of urgent texts from her executive assistant. One message contained a link. Olivia opened it. A photo filled the screen immediately. The image showed the entrance of Marcus's apartment building just before sunrise. In the picture, she was stepping out of the blue pickup truck while Marcus stood nearby, holding the passenger door open. The angle made the moment look more intimate than it actually was. Olivia exhaled slowly and lowered the phone for a moment, staring at the floor while the information settled in her mind. Marcus spoke carefully from the kitchen. "Something wrong?" Olivia looked up at him, her expression calm but clearly troubled. "Someone took a photograph outside your building," she said quietly. Marcus frowned slightly, but did not step closer. Olivia held up the phone so he could see the article headline beneath the image. It read that the chief executive officer of Whitmore Logistics had spent the night at the apartment of a maintenance employee from her own company. Marcus studied the screen for a moment before looking away again. His reaction was surprisingly calm. "People like stories," he said simply. Olivia gave a small nod, but continued scrolling. Another message appeared from one of the board members, asking her to come to the office immediately. Several others carried the same tone of urgency. Marcus returned to the stove and flipped the last pancake onto the plate. The ordinary smell of breakfast filled the kitchen even as the situation on Olivia's phone continued to grow more complicated. After a moment, he carried the plate to the table and set it down beside the syrup. "You should eat something before the day gets loud again," he said. Olivia looked toward the plate, but did not move right away. The apartment still felt calm around her, even though the outside world had already begun turning the quiet moment into something else entirely. She finally stood and walked slowly to the table, setting the phone face down beside the coffee mug. This could become a problem for you, she said honestly. Marcus poured another small cup of coffee and sat across from her. Maybe, he replied. Olivia studied his face again, searching for frustration or fear, but the same steady composure remained. You are not worried? She asked. Marcus cut a small piece of pancake and shrugged slightly. I did not do anything wrong, he said. Olivia lowered her eyes to the table, considering that simple answer. In her world, things were rarely that straightforward. Public perception had its own rules and its own consequences. Yet here in the small apartment the situation felt almost absurdly simple. A man had helped someone get home safely. Nothing more. Olivia reached for the fork and finally took a small bite of breakfast while the sunlight continued filling the room. For a moment neither of them spoke again. The quiet returned briefly, but both of them understood that outside the apartment door the day had already begun moving faster than either of them expected. Olivia finished the last sip of coffee and looked at the phone resting beside her plate. The screen lit up again with another message from the corporate office. The calm of the apartment felt almost unreal compared to the storm waiting outside. She picked up the phone slowly and read the newest message. The board had scheduled an emergency meeting in less than 90 minutes. They wanted her in the office immediately. Marcus stood and carried the empty pan to the sink, rinsing it under warm water. The quiet domestic routine continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Olivia watched him for a moment before speaking again. Marcus, this story is going to grow today, she said carefully. People in my world do not let things like this stay simple. Marcus dried his hands on a towel and leaned lightly against the counter. Then you should probably go handle it, he replied. Olivia nodded once, but did not move toward the door yet. Her eyes drifted across the apartment again, lingering on the drawings on the refrigerator and the model rocket on the table. The peacefulness of the room felt like something she did not want to rush away from. But the phone vibrated again. This time the caller identification showed the name of the chairman of the board. Olivia silenced the call and slipped the phone into her coat pocket. They think you took advantage of the situation, she said quietly. Marcus did not react immediately. He simply looked out the small kitchen window where the morning sunlight had begun reflecting off the rooftops across the street. People can think what they want, he said after a moment. Truth usually takes longer to travel. Olivia studied his expression carefully. There was no anger in his voice, just patience, the kind of patience that comes from years of learning, that the world does not always listen right away. She walked toward the door and picked up her heels from beside the couch. If they ask questions, she said, they might call you in. Marcus nodded calmly. Then I will answer them. Olivia paused with her hand on the doorknob. You understand that this could affect your job. Marcus gave a small shrug that carried more quiet confidence than worry. I came to work yesterday expecting to mop floors, he said. I will do the same thing tomorrow. Olivia watched him for a long moment, as if trying to understand a language she had not heard in years. In her world, every action came with strategy, consequences, negotiations. But Marcus spoke as if integrity was its own answer. She finally opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The wooden stairs creaked softly as she descended toward the street. When she reached the bottom step, she turned back briefly. Marcus stood at the top of the staircase, one hand resting against the doorframe, the morning light behind him. Neither of them said anything more. Olivia stepped outside into the cold air where the city was already fully awake. A black company sedan waited at the curb, the driver standing beside the door with a worried expression. As Olivia approached the car, she could see a man across the street lifting a camera toward her. The quiet night that had existed only hours earlier was gone now. The day had begun to tell its own version of the story. The black sedan moved through downtown traffic with the quiet precision of a vehicle used to important schedules. Olivia sat in the back seat staring through the tinted window while the city passed in steady motion outside. Her phone continued vibrating in her coat pocket, but she ignored it for several minutes. The peaceful apartment she had just left behind already felt far away. When the car finally stopped in front of Whitmore Logistics headquarters, several reporters were standing near the entrance. Cameras lifted the moment the door opened. Olivia stepped out calmly, her posture straight, her expression composed in the way years of leadership had trained her to be. Questions began flying immediately, but she walked past them without answering. Inside the building, the lobby felt colder than usual. Employees moved quietly, their voices lowered as if the building itself had. become aware of the story spreading online. Olivia stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the executive floor. When the doors opened upstairs, her assistant was already waiting near the hallway with a tablet clutched tightly in both hands. "The board is in the conference room," the assistant said quickly. "They have been waiting." Olivia nodded and walked down the corridor without slowing. Inside the large glass conference room, 12 board members sat around the table, their expressions tight with concern and curiosity. The moment Olivia entered the room, the conversation stopped. The chairman of the board folded his hands together and looked at her carefully. "Olivia," he began, "we need an explanation." Olivia placed her phone on the table and remained standing for a moment before sitting down. The screen still displayed the photograph from outside Marcus's apartment. The chairman slid a printed copy of the same image across the table. "This picture is everywhere," he continued. "News outlets are suggesting that you spent the night with one of our maintenance employees." Olivia studied the image quietly before speaking. "I did spend the night at that building," she said. Several members exchanged looks immediately. One of them leaned forward. "This could damage the company if it continues to spread," the woman said firmly. Another voice added, "Human Resources has already suspended the employee until we understand the situation." Olivia looked up sharply at that statement. "Suspended?" she repeated. The chairman nodded once. "Until we determine whether there was misconduct." The room waited for her response. Olivia leaned back slightly in her chair and let the silence stretch across the table for several seconds. She thought about the small apartment filled with drawings, the calm voice that had asked no questions, the simple breakfast waiting in the kitchen. Finally she spoke. "Marcus Hale did nothing wrong," she said clearly. "Last night I attended a company celebration that ran later than expected. I was not in a condition to drive home safely. He helped me." One of the board members frowned. "And you stayed at his residence?" Olivia nodded without hesitation. "Yes," she said. "On his couch." The room remained quiet for a moment as the words settled. The chairman glanced again at the photograph before looking back at Olivia. "Are you certain there was nothing inappropriate about the situation?" Olivia met his gaze directly. "The only thing inappropriate about this situation," she said calmly, "is that a man who helped his employer get home safely is now being punished for it." The board members shifted slightly in their seats while the tension in the room began to change direction. The conference room remained quiet after Olivia spoke. Several board members exchanged looks while the chairman leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her expression with careful attention. The printed photograph still rested in the center of the table, but the tone of the room had shifted. One of the directors adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "If the employee simply helped you get home safely," he said slowly, "then suspending him may have been premature." Olivia did not respond immediately. She simply folded her hands on the table and allowed the silence to stretch long enough for the weight of the moment to settle across the room. Finally, the chairman nodded once. "We will correct that," he said. "Human Resources will reinstate Marcus Hale immediately while we release a statement clarifying the situation." Olivia gave a small nod of acknowledgement. The tension that had filled the room began to loosen. One by one, the board members gathered their documents, the urgency of the meeting dissolving into the quiet realization that the story outside the building had been built on speculation rather than truth. Within the hour, the company issued a public statement explaining that the chief executive officer had accepted assistance from an employee after a late company event and that no misconduct had occurred. The news cycle moved quickly, and by early afternoon, the headlines that had started the morning began shifting toward other stories. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus stood in the maintenance corridor of the Whitmore Logistics building holding the same mop he had carried every morning for the past 3 years. The floor beneath the polished hallway lights reflected the tall glass windows lining the upper floors of the building. A supervisor approached him quietly with a clipboard and a faintly embarrassed expression. "Marcus," the man said, "Human Resources asked me to let you know your suspension has been lifted. You are cleared to return to your regular schedule." Marcus nodded once as if the news had been expected all along. "Thank you," he replied calmly. The supervisor hesitated for a moment before walking away, leaving Marcus alone with the quiet echo of footsteps down the hall. A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened at the far end of the corridor. Olivia stepped out, her posture composed, but her eyes searching until they found him standing beside the bucket and mop. She walked toward him slowly while several employees nearby pretended to focus on their work. When she reached him, she stopped a few feet away. "I wanted to make sure you were back," she said. Marcus leaned lightly on the mop handle and gave a small nod. "Looks that way," he answered. Olivia glanced briefly at the polished floor and then back at him. "I am sorry the situation turned into something bigger than it should have," she said. Marcus shook his head gently. "Sometimes the world talks louder than the truth," he replied. Olivia studied his calm expression and allowed herself a small smile. "You know," she said quietly, "you never asked for anything in return." Marcus shrugged slightly and looked down the long hallway before answering. "Helping someone get home safe is not a favor," he said. "It is just the right thing to do." Olivia nodded once more, then turned and walked back toward the elevator. Marcus watched her for a moment before returning his attention to the floor beneath his feet. The building slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, but something subtle had changed. In a world that often measured people by titles and offices, one quiet night had reminded them both that dignity sometimes lived in the smallest moments.